As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Welcome back to another episode of The Malcolm Effect. Joining me once again is a voice you're familiar with, Professor Alana Lentin, someone I consider a teacher. Welcome back to The Malcolm Effect.
Thanks, Mamadou. Thanks so much for having me.
It's an absolute honor and privilege, and a voice you're familiar with, the formidable Deej. Now, before we carry on this conversation, you all know that content creation is not cheap, and I am committed and dedicated to keeping everything on The Malcolm Effect for free in terms of the podcast. So if you haven't already, please check out the Patreon link, which can be found in the episode description. Thank you for all the support. It's much appreciated. Now back to the episode. Let's go straight into it. We're talking all things woke. You will be hard pressed to turn on a mainstream news outlet or right-wing news outlet without hearing the word woke. It has been bastardized, and people now use it for a term that means everything and nothing at the same time. My first question to you then is, where did the term woke come from?
Well, it's actually quite an interesting story. I think this has been reported, or parts of it have been reported in, online media and so on, but I'm not sure how widely known it is. So I think most people know that the term woke comes from African American Vernacular English, or AAVE, and they possibly also know that it originates actually pretty long time ago, so around the sort of early 20th century, but they might not know the whole kind of history of it, at least part of the history that I've been looking into. And it actually connects to a song that was written by a blues singer called Leadbelly. And he wrote it in the context of the 1931 case of the Scottsboro Boys. But it's also connected partially, even before that, to the 1923 call by Marcus Garvey, who was, of course, the founder of the Negro Improvement Association, which Robin Kelly, in his book Freedom Dreams, calls the largest African redemption movement in the history of the world. And Marcus Garvey was calling on Black people around the world in the context of the assault on Ethiopia to wake up Ethiopia, wake up Africa, he said. And this was, Robin Kelly says, a call to global Black citizens to become more socially and politically conscious. So he didn't actually use the word woke, but there was this this notion that Black consciousness had to be about waking up to reality, seeing the truth and understanding how the world works. So coming back to the Leadbelly story, so he wrote this song in 1938 about this case of these 9 teenagers. They were very young boys between the age, I think, of 13 to the end of their teens. And they were on a train, and at Scottsboro, Alabama, they were arrested because they'd been accused of rape by 2 white women. Very common story, as we know. And the reason this is interesting, and the reason I think saying a little bit more about that history connects to the story about woke, is that you said yourself, woke is often used in the right-wing press. And very often you'll notice that there's a connection made between wokeness and leftism, or even communism or socialism, this kind of hysteria about this. And this actually goes back a really long way in the history of sort of Black movements in the United States. So the reason the Scottsboro case is interesting in this regard, not only because it was an extremely famous case within the history of kind of Black struggle in the 20th century, but also because it was taken up by the American Communist Party and their auxiliary organization, the International Labor Defense, or the ILD. And they took up the Scottsboro Boys case because at their first trial, obviously they didn't have adequate legal representation, and they were very hastily convicted, and all but one of them was sentenced to death. So the ILD hired this really successful lawyer called Samuel Leibovitz to defend the boys. But what was interesting is that the case became a flashpoint in a conflict between the NAACP and the Communist Party, or the ILD, where the NAACP was accusing the ILD of using these Black teenagers for their own kind of propaganda purposes. And Robin Kelly again writes about this in an article that I can share with you can share with the listeners. The communists were responding to the NAACP and saying that actually the reason that this case was very important is that it was representative of wider injustice across the American South. They said it was impossible for these boys to have an impartial trial. And they also realized that you couldn't just fight through legal means. So the reason they were in conflict with the NAACP is that they wanted a more kind of an approach taken through the courts and through policy. And the Communist Party was saying, no, we actually have to encourage mass mobilization. And there were protests as far and wide as South Africa and Moscow about the Scottsboro Boys case. And it shows, according to Robin Kelly and others, how the Communist Party helped to make the African American cause an internationalist one. And the reason for this was not just some kind of benevolence by white communists for, Black teenagers. It was because it was at this time, partly owing to the importance of this case, that many Black people began to join the Communist Party. Claudia Jones, somebody whose name, the name is very familiar. She was active on their case. In their recent collection of Black communist women's writing, Charisse Burden-Stelly and Jodi Dean write about the importance of this case for kind of, bringing Black people into the party. And Robin Kelly also notes that there was a lot of cultural production around this case. And that's why we get that Lead Belly song in which he tells people to stay woke. And, this is particularly about the Scottsboro case, as I said. And I think, just to finish this point, I don't think it's surprising that woke has come under attack by the right today, because you often get this link, as I said earlier, between anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-transphobia, efforts to decolonize the curriculum and so on and so forth, and communism or socialism. So there's this notion that it's all kind of this right-wing plot to indoctrinate your kids and turn them woke or whatever it might be.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for laying that out for us. But thinking about the terrain in most of the Western world, it seems like the right have won when it comes to meaning making. So how were they able to capture this in this iteration of anti-leftist politics that comes in the form of being anti-woke?
How they were able to capture it. I mean, obviously, you said it yourself at the beginning, the media in most of the world, or at least in the Western world where this has purchase, is basically right wing. Okay. And I think we need to look further back. I mean, one thing I think we need to say at the outset is that there's no way of separating woke out from anti-Blackness, right? And although a lot of the, for example, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, his anti-woke bill, right, also was very much focused on the rights of LGBTQIA plus people. But there's no way really of separating these two things out. And I think it's a mistake on the left to try to see, anti-racism over here and gender rights over there, right? These two things are very much cemented. And we see, for example, how it's most often Black women, Black non-binary and trans people who are very much at the most pointy edge of the attacks on bodily autonomy and reproductive rights. So this is very much anti-Black, and it comes at a time of mass mobilization, of course, within the context of the global movement for Black lives. We saw the explosion of that protest, or those protests, particularly in the summer of 2020, after the atrocious state murder of George Floyd, of course. And so that's the context for it. And that's what kind of creates the atmosphere in which these kinds of, what I sometimes refer to as moral panic, but I think it's much more than that. I think we need to see it as a counterinsurgent attack on this global uprising, right? So that's the kind of the context for it. But why have they managed to capture that language, or why is the right being successful on that? I think we need to zoom out. So not only do we have this anti-Blackness, which is fundamental to it, but we also have a much longer history, and I've written quite a lot about this, about racism being made debatable. And this is a concept I take from my friend and co-writer Gavin Titley, who wrote about the debatability of racism. And we all know about this, right? You see these kinds of panel shows where people debate whether or not it's racist to do X, right? Or is this scenario really racist? Or shouldn't we have an open and honest? It's very interesting how these debates are always open and honest when the right is having them, but never really open and honest from their perspective when the left is having them, right? There's always some kind of nefarious agenda. We must have an open and honest debate about refugees, or we have to have an open and honest debate about whether, decolonization or tearing down statues is not the worst crime in the world and this kind of thing. So you create this atmosphere of debatability in which basically everything is open for debate and everything is equal. There's no kind of understanding that some things are beyond the pale, that some things need to be attacked, lest we see the rise and resurgence of fascism, which I think it's fair to say we're actually witnessing today. So this idea of what they sometimes like to call on the debate on the right, viewpoint diversity, right? That we'll get to somehow the kernel of truth by airing all views. And it really turns matters of survival into a sport, a sort of a spectator sport for the white population.
Thank you so much for that. So I want to kind of, I guess, unpack that or dig further then. Given that the right has been so successful in meaning making, has been so successful in capturing slogans which have radical roots, is it that we totally disavow and abandon sloganeering as a tactic, even though I recognize that sloganeering oftentimes can be a form of mobilization, as it's quick to get out of people's tongues and it's a form of mass mobilization. But given that it always has the ability of being captured, do you think as the left we should just disavow sloganeering or these kind of tactics?
I mean, I don't really think any of this is about language. I think the language is a conduit. And I think we do ourselves a disservice by focusing too much on this because it kind of doesn't really matter what words you use. Because woke, if we just want to isolate that out, and I also think it would be a mistake to isolate woke out. It's interesting, just to make a parenthesis, because I'm currently writing about the war on critical race theory. And there's a kind of been a progression from the focus on critical race theory by the right as an object of attack to kind of this more general focus on woke or wokeism, right, which has been more exportable because, of course, critical race theory is quite particular as a subject of study to the United States. It's not very much taught in other places. So it was easy for the right in the United States to relaunch an attack the university, which is seen as a hotbed of kind of Marxist indoctrination since, forever, but particularly within the kind of the fervent anti-communism. I wish it was anti-capitalism, but anti-communism of the 1950s and 1960s with the attacks from the right on particular academics. So that's that. And you see this happening periodically. You see it with the complete now cancellation of affirmative action, the attack on ethnic studies, all of this kind of thing. So one of the principal actors in the so-called war on critical race theory is a nasty character called Chris Rufo. I think he calls himself a senior research fellow or something. They like to give themselves these titles that make them sound, more serious than they are. He works for this right-wing think tank called the Manhattan Institute in the States. Various people, including Professor of Political Science Eric Kaufman from Birkbeck College in London. So there's an international connection. He's got a fellowship there as well. That's just an interesting connection because for me, he's one of the principal actors in this kind of making racism debatable and really kind of, making connections with the far right. But, leaving that aside. But what Christopher Rufo said was that critical race theory is a much better object of scorn for the right than something like woke, because woke is too vague, right? So I find that quite interesting, what kind of language works, but maybe he was wrong because woke or wokeism seems to have taken on this international it's taken wings and flown. You even have in France, President Macron talking about le wokeisme as this kind of, French importation of an American idea that has no place in so-called secular France, where we are all universalists and we shouldn't be focusing on anybody's, racialized positioning, et cetera, right? So, however, coming back to all of this, what's obvious when you start to listen to key actors like Christopher Rufo, he's one of the main ideologues of the war on critical race theory, stroke the war on woke, is that the language it's like a packaging around a set of actions, which they've been very successful at carrying out. And what they do is that they what the right has, particularly in the United States, first of all, they have a lot of money and they're able to action what looks like grassroots organizations and spur them into action very quickly, right? And these are not real grassroots organizations. They're heavily funded lobby groups that look like grassroots organizations, and they're able to sort of reactivate those activists in a very easy way. So a lot of the people who are involved in protests against not just critical race theory in school, bathrooms for trans people in school, things like books, so library boards, what books can be read and what books can't be read, all of these kinds of things, they're actually Tea Party activists. So they're people who were kind of brought together and very often paid during the Obama era in the United States, to mobilize against Obama. There was this whole, I don't know if people even remember this, but all of this stuff about, was Obama really born in the United States? Birtherism, right? So this truth, like Donald Trump was a main proponent of the idea that Obama was actually not American. And so those activists can be reactivated around new issues. You also saw them coming out against mask mandates and vaccination mandates during COVID. So it's easy for the right to do this because they have a lot of money and a lot of kind of tentacles in many kind of different spheres, particularly in the United States, but also, for example, in the UK. Get into that if you like.
Absolutely. I want to kind of hand over to Deej, actually, if you want to also tackle the question of the right and its ability for meaning making and what we can do.
You broke up, but I think what you said was, if I can sort of answer the question of the right's kind of systems of meaning making.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to follow Alana because I think that Alana's so well. And I think that whilst in agreement that language really doesn't matter, there is something to be said about how well the language has been mobilized within the right, how well they've been able to do this work of making everything and anything mean woke, right? And that's something that you see is also being actually taken on by many people who would call themselves like leftists or progressives. And I think for me, there's like a real kind of strange contradiction here, right? And that strange contradiction being absolutely the right has mobilized in frightening ways, are using this terminology to oftentimes enact the most violent and ridiculous policies, focusing on the most ridiculous points of politics. But I also look at how the left responds to this, and it leaves me with some troubles, right? I think that there's obviously a sort of radical liberalism, a radical neoliberalism even, that we see in the sort of identitarian politics that has become rife, especially in social media and especially within our sort of media era, and is taken up oftentimes by a lot of well-meaning young people who would like to consider themselves progressive, but whose politics has always been relatively surface level, relatively about symbolism. And I think because so much of progressive politics is now orientated around the right language, the right terminology, the right symbolism, who can say a phrase, who can't say a phrase, we've also opened the terrain for the types of strategic targeting of a lot of our politics. And for me, a lot of that has to do with the de-radicalization of our politics and the dematerialization of our politics, right? Where we've gotten into a thing where it's all about having the perfect slogan and getting into petty fights about who owns what symbolism, what is the right word to say something, and have started to engage in a form of policing of each other oftentimes that is wholly like useless and destroys the ability for us to strategize and organize. And the right, whilst they don't always have consensus, are really, really good at strategizing and organizing. And I think oftentimes, because of this inability, I think, especially in the kind of current conjuncture, for people to really grapple with the fact that the fight isn't going to be in language, the fight isn't going to be in symbols, the fight has to be with the people on the streets. It has to be like mobilization just has to happen, organizing has to happen, it has to be the main priority, that we're losing a lot, and I myself am getting quite disillusioned being in organizing spaces where we're spending more of our time dealing with things that are, whilst important, are far too distracting than feeding people and freeing people.
I mean, I think that's absolutely right. But I think Mamadou's question was on why is the right so good at capturing the language? And I think what I want to emphasize, whereas those things that you're pointing out are extremely true and they happen and they're a real detriment, at the same time, I don't think that anything that the left can do, I mean, everything that the left will do, or the anti-racist specifically will do, will be picked up by the right and will be attacked. And the machinery, as you know, as you said, that they have is simply much larger and much, they're much better, and they have a much longer history of being able to do this. And so the only way to kind of counter this is through, as you say, material politics. And kind of one thing I was inspired by somebody saying, part of the problem, and it's paradoxical because we're having the conversation, but part of the problem is in our responses, right? In our trying to kind of make sense of what the right is doing, we tend to kind of get wrapped up in what should the response be, rather than actually doing the actions that anyway we're accused of doing, right? We're accused of being, fomenting communist plots or, and,
Absolutely.
plots to overthrow the state. Well, yeah, let's get on with
Let's do
overthrowing the
that.
state.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Instead of like,
Exactly.
wasting time talking about, what's the best terminology for this, that, and the other.
Yeah. And
So I
also,
think that's important.
yeah,
Yeah,
and
go
also
on.
wasting time, like you said, trying to think of a response or centering ourselves or allowing ourselves to get caught up in the distractions of it. It doesn't matter what we say, what we do, the kind of red scare that is infected and part of the global order will always be there. You just do it
That's
anyway.
right. Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, one other thing I wanted to point out about this, and you said it at the beginning when you were talking about neoliberalism, and I think this connects to this viewpoint diversity thing, is that you don't, unfortunately, leave this up only to the right. Of course, we can have a debate about who's right and who's left, but there are people who see themselves as leftist, who see wokeness as being evil incarnate, and have spent
Mhm.
a lot of time and energy attacking it in, for example, a series of books that have been published lately by people who profess to be from the left. So
Yeah.
there's a book that was published recently by the German-American philosopher Susan Neiman called Left is Not Woke, or Woke is Not Left. I can't even remember what the title is exactly. And her argument is that basically by allowing itself to become woke, whatever this means, the left has drifted away from Enlightenment principles, which are, of course, the real principles, according to her, which are going to lead us to redemption or whatever it might be. And, it's very, very interesting that you have these kinds of very short sighted, often very detached academic actors writing these things or speaking about these things. And really, they too, for my money, are participating in the fundamental anti-blackness, anti-communism of the right by assuming that anything that's touched by Black consciousness raising, activism, and popular culture is necessarily going to be bad for the left. Arguing as she does in that book that in order to fight racism, we merely have to read Voltaire, right? And I'm not joking, this is literally in the book, is a real problem as far as I'm concerned. And it also, I think, one last thing I want to say, it's also very problematic because, of course, it dovetails with the anti-trans, the political transphobia that you also see on sectors of the left. So, there's, or the so-called left, very often the attacks on woke, even while professing to be anti-racist. A particular book that I'm thinking about does this work. I think the title is called Cancelled: The Left Way Back from Woke, or something like that.
Mhm.
And it's basically a barely veiled transphobic text. And that's what it is. So that route, and that's why I said earlier that it's so important to look at, race and gender together when we're having these conversations.
Absolutely. And I'm thinking through like what some of these fears from people who would identify with themselves as being on the left are. And it tends to be people who at their core have very kind of politically conservative values. And there's a
Yeah,
deep fear of, what I think is just a sort of progressivism of the time, where young people are way more politicized. And absolutely, yes, sometimes this falls on identitarian lines, but that basic drive for trans people, for people of color to have decent lives seems to be so abhorrent to those who have historically been or viewed themselves as the arbiters of freedom. So when our conceptions of freedom don't fall neatly into their lines, there's this panic, there's this fear, there's this need to disavow anything that looks like a different conception of freedom.
absolutely.
And I can just want to, I guess, put it to both of you again then. We speak about those on the left who come out and have this disavowal of the term woke, but they do so in defense, or what they believe is in the defense of material politics. So they say things like the left has lost its way. The left used to speak about class struggle and class analysis, and now we're focused on quote unquote the woke. What do you think of that?
I mean, I think that there's a very, I think very often the people who say that are very detached from taking on board the critiques that Deej made, of course, about a certain tendency to make things about, the superficial. I do agree that that's there. However, one of the things I often throw into the mix is I wonder how much of that has got to do with the social media landscape. I don't know, and maybe I'm detached, maybe I don't know, but I always wonder, do people really have these conversations at organizing meetings about language? Maybe they do, but I wager that a lot of the campaigns, the more grassroots campaigns, I'm thinking about people, let's talk about migrants and refugees in Ireland, for example, who are mobilizing against direct provision, which is the system that migrants and asylum seekers are forced to live in these kind of appalling conditions, and they're mobilizing constantly. I always think to myself about groups like that who are very active on the ground in communities. To what extent are they concerned with the more superficial? I doubt it. I just think that we get everything filtered these days through social media, so we tend to think that this is a bigger problem than it is, right? And I actually think that a lot of the people on the so-called left who say that we need to get back to a real class or materialist politics, I often wonder to what extent they're actually involved in those politics. Very often when you see what they're focused on, they're very concerned with what happens at universities, and that always sends an alarm bell to me, because it means that you actually yourself, you haven't walked outside the campus, right? So you think that everything is campus politics, particularly in the US, right? But not only, right? And so when you make these examples, and they do sound outrageous, like, I could cite examples from things that I've read, but without boring you with the details. But you think, yeah, this sounds outrageous. Like, why would anybody be going on about, you use this language and we're going to, we're going to purge you because you said this wrong thing. And, I just don't think that it's as widespread as these people imply. And I think they participate in a demonization of the popular left and a folding of everything together, reduction of everything to everything by doing this. Because, of course, those people, let's look at something like Jacobin. Like, they have a massive readership. So that's what gets out there. And we know more about that than we know about these much smaller grassroots activities that everyday people are involved in all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to Alana's point, a lot of the discourse surrounding oftentimes the most superficial of these kinds of ideas and these kinds of discourses tends to be on the college campus, right? It tends to be
Mm,
university discourses. But in the real world, obviously, it's permeating into the real world in a really real way that's quite terrifying. To your question, though, I think that there's a materialist analysis of absolutely everything, right? And there is a materialist analysis of transphobia. There's a material analysis of gender. All of those things exist. And so
mm,
leftists who seem to not understand that anti-racism, the trans inclusion, all of those politics that outwardly appear to be superficial to them or seem like this, very disparaging conception of wokeness as they've come to, are also not organizing with like trans people, are also not organizing anti-racist
yeah.
circles. In those circles, it's not really about the right, getting everything right, but it's mostly about ensuring that people survive, right? And trans survival is an absolute part of my politics. It should be a part of our politics,
Mm,
ensuring that the realities and the conditions under which white supremacy and racism affect the lives of people of color is an absolute reality, and it is absolutely
mm,
intersected with global politics in such a mass way that to
yeah.
think of it as immaterial, to think of it as superficial, is to really miss what I think is an actual material analysis. And that's to say that if we're bound to orthodoxy in the way a lot of people are, if we just need everything to have been written about in Das Kapital in order to consider it materialist, then we're going to completely miss the entire body of work that comes after Marx and the importance of shifting Marxism, the importance of shifting our conceptions of communism and socialism to the current
Mm,
conjuncture. We are not in the 18th century, right? So we can't theorize simply on the basis of the 18th century. History has happened since then. And that history is a materialist history that also needs to be accounted for in order to actually understand our current political conditions. If you're not doing that, then
mm,
absolutely you're going to think trans rights is unimportant or anti-racism is
mm.
unimportant. But some of the best, most successful internationalist movement were founded on anti-racist principles. So then what? And
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Alana.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, you inspired me to think that actually these problems are a lot more long-standing. You said, like, we're not in the 19th century anymore, but a lot of the same problems existed. If you look at the history of the United States or, the United Kingdom, any of the kind of the countries of the imperial core, you see white workers, not all of them, but many white workers, expressing what Gerald Horne, the African American historian, calls class collaboration with the ruling class against Black workers, migrant workers, indigenous people, and so on, right? And so these kind of politics have always been there. So when people on the left say we need to stop thinking about the superficial, what they think of as the superficial politics of race and gender, and get back to brass tacks, what they're actually doing is, carrying on in a long tradition. And they're kind of, they're lying that they're doing the real materialist politics of anti-racism, because very often what they're doing is actually, through setting this aside and saying that it's superficial, they're actually, reenacting this class collaboration, which aligns very well with very worrying concerns on the right. So one of the things I was thinking about, that the reason you're having this kind of resurgence of this really reactionary moment, is because at the same time you have this nativist politics very strong in Europe, anti-immigrationism, the idea of the great replacement, this idea that multiculturalism and immigration is going to lead to the demise of white nations, white people in Europe and elsewhere casting themselves as the true indigenous people, which is very interesting when you think about the co-optation of anti-racist language or anti-colonialist language, and a kind of left that tacitly participates in upholding that. So, the kind of, what do they call them? The patriotic leftists, or the left patriots, or whatever they call them. These people are participating in upholding the idea that, yes, white people have more of a right to exist in society. White people or cis straight people have more of a right to exist in society than other people. And that's, again, as you were saying very clearly, is not a politics that any of us should countenance.
Absolutely. And I think the thing too, when you think about how this politics is often espoused, you would assume that, or the hyper focus on this material politics oftentimes is focused on what we consider like a worker and what we consider not a worker. And it oftentimes focuses solely on like what their conception of the economy is, and we've had this conversation before, without ever recognizing the political part is actually the social relations of gender, race, and all these things that kind of constitute how we live under capitalism. But for me, it's also like drawing a materialist politics recognizes the fact that like trans people are laborers, Black people are laborers, Black people are workers. They fit into the economy. Their exclusion from the economy, their precarity in the economy, through policy, through law, through the juridical system, should be of concern to us. It absolutely should be of concern to us, because the point is, if someone who is transphobic is in a position of power, refuses to hire trans people, if policy aligns with transphobia, trans people are quite literally going to die. They're not going to be able to feed themselves. If policy aligns with racism, Black people are going to die. They are dying, in fact, as are trans people. And that's why, for me, that will never be a separate issue to my politics.
Absolutely. And to return it to the history of wokeism and the history of the Scottsboro boys that I described at the top, I mean, when they talk about the case galvanizing Black people and bringing them into the Communist Party, so obviously Black people as workers are choosing to join the party because of their support for the Scottsboro boys, and you can see the direct connection between Black people as workers and other marginalized people as workers and the left, right? And history has shown us that relationship didn't survive for reasons to do with, again, class collaboration and the failure to take seriously the politics of race and the ongoing conditions of racial capitalism.
Absolutely.
No, thank you so much. I kind of wanted to similar lines, but on the question of a culture war that seems to be, we are embroiled in. Some people are refusing to engage, while other who chase clout are on every single media platform talking about a culture war. So I guess my question is, to what do we owe this current instantiation of the culture war, in your understanding, Alana?
Look, I really resist the language of culture war, and I don't think that we should use it. Personally, I think that this is a counterinsurgency, and that it involves, it's not just coming from the right, as we've already described. It comes from elements on the so-called left, or certainly on the liberal side of things. And it's, as I said earlier, it is mobilized in reaction to Black uprising. It's mobilized in reaction to trans and gender nonconforming people mobilizing for their survival. And I think, again, it's in the context of this white anxiety that they're being replaced. And it's a fight back. It's a white lash, to use that popular expression. And when we use the concept of culture war, two things are going on. Firstly, it's a war, right? It's a conflict. It's a little bit like describing colonialism in Palestine as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is obviously a euphemism of the first order. What you have here is the powerful attacking the weak, right? So it's an attack. It's not a war, right? As in, it's not a two-sided war. Wars often are one-sided, but you know what I'm saying. This is kind of this idea that it's a conflict within the kind of ambit of viewpoint diversity, and we're all just expressing our views and so on. What we have is the taking away of freedoms from people, right? Freedoms to study, freedoms to decide what to do with their own bodies, freedoms to reproduce, or to not be forced into being sterilized, which is of course the flip side of the whole thing about the attacks on abortion rights in the United States. What people don't talk about is the number of Black and Indigenous and migrant women who are forcibly sterilized, particularly when incarcerated. So that whole thing just goes away. There's all of this stuff being mobilized by the state with the help of its propaganda arm, right? The media, both the mainstream and the right-wing media. And the idea that this is kind of a conflict, I think, veils that. So that's the very important thing. The other thing is, I think when people say culture war, there's this notion that culture is kind of superficial and it's not it's not imbricated in, or it's not deeply related to politics, economy, the social, etc. Just as, again, to return to the Scottsboro case, the case was expressed through song, through plays, through all of this kind of thing, then culture is an incredibly important vehicle for promoting ideas among the masses. And it's always interesting to me how it becomes, particularly from the left that sees itself as more serious and more materialist, how it becomes an object of scorn. Maybe you have a different view.
No, I mean, again, beautifully said. I think there was something actually for me that I've taken from your writing that I used to look at how the language around the culture wars is kind of framed, and why I also don't subscribe to that language. And I think it's because it's become very unfavorable to speak and name directly what you're in opposition to, right? To say that this culture war is actually about anti-Blackness, anti-migrant sentiment, to say quite plainly it's actually a racism that is being discussed and that is being debated, becomes unfavorable, because there's this kind of anxiety around naming racism and naming race, right? And a need to make things seem like not racism. And I think that for a long time, especially in the sort of downturn of a sort of like historical scientific racism and specifically naming those types of racisms, things then become about culture, right? So it's not that we don't want brown people around us, it's that their culture is different. It's not that we don't want Black people, it's just their culture is different. And then the culture becomes the terrain, not the actual elements of racism that we are all familiar with. And I think this is something that is really, really present, especially in Britain, right? There's this kind of courteousness to the way Britain oftentimes deals with and discusses and engages with racism that needs to call it anything but. And that's where, for me, this language sits, right? Because when it's about culture, especially in the minds of the masses, then it can't be racist, right? If it's not about the actual skin tone or the phrenology of migrants, but it's about their cultural practices, then that's certainly not racism, right? And I think that's the terrain that this is being leveraged on. That's the space through which this discourse is being mobilized, because it's too impolite to say we want to just be brazenly racist. We need to frame this as us defending our culture without naming that what we're defending is this kind of very conservative notion of whiteness that we want to protect, so we feel as though is being threatened. That's how the language becomes mobilized for me. It's not about transness. It's about the culture of protecting what women, about of womanhood. All that kind of language, I think, feeds into the way it's mobilized. And that's why I think it's really important now more than ever to not only just do the work, because they're going to call you whatever anyway, but also to be unafraid of saying what you're saying, to be unafraid to say that I'm an anti-racist, to be unafraid to say I'm a communist. They're going to call you one anyway. These are all things they think are pejoratives. And so
Exactly.
we shouldn't also allow them the terrain to determine how they want their discourse to be called, right? So, no, actually, if I'm a communist, this isn't a conversation about the culture war. This is about the fact that you're a fascist. So let's talk about that, you know?
That's absolutely right. That's a really good way of putting it. I think that's right, because they have no problem with calling us names. So it's very interesting how we skirt around the issue. And I think to a certain extent it is about how the left has accepted the terms of the conversation set by the right or set by the liberal core, that talking about race, talking about racism is always in excess of the situation, and that it's kind of impolite, right? Or that it, to use the language of certain elements of the left, that it participates in naturalizing race as a category and so on and so forth. And what we're talking about, of course, is race as a political project to make people vulnerable to premature death, to use Ruth Wilson Gilmore's terminology. It's a very good and stark way of explaining what the purposes of racism is. And in order to be able to maintain, produce, and reproduce white supremacy, as I've put it. So this, by naming this, plainly, it becomes much more difficult for them to come back at us. And I think that point that you made there is extremely important in terms of how we respond.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I guess my final question, which you both spoke to, but I'm going to ask in the Lenin fashion, what is to be
Mm-hmm.
done? Because we just seem like we're being beat on every single front at the moment. I know there's some movement taking place, and obviously, again, the global south always puts a lot of the Western left to shame. But for those of us that have an eye in the Western left or exist within that category, what do you think is to be done?
Okay, I mean, I think partly we've answered this, but I think one thing that we have to do, and this is not something that any of us do, right? But some people out there do it, we have to refuse to engage. I
Mhm.
don't think that there is anything to be gained by engaging with those who want our destruction. Much as I like to listen to a good takedown of, let's say, Christopher Rufo or any of these characters. You see this on, like, Mark Lamont Hill, for example, did it. I mean, it's very funny. It's very good because he's so much more intelligent than Chris Rufo. He interviews him and he, asks him to name one thing that he likes about whiteness. And of course, Chris Rufo can't answer, and he has him tongue twisted and so on. But at the same time, when you invite somebody like that onto your platform, or when certain so-called leftists go onto right-wing platforms, you accept the terms of the debate, right? You allow them into our spaces, and you also publicly acknowledge that there's a problem, right? And I think in the same way that they crowd us out, I think we need to crowd them out with a lot less power than we have. And practically what that means is to continue to do work which is much more less visible, much more silent. And that's the work of political education in spaces, sometimes public spaces like this one, which is very, very important, but also in private spaces, within groups, within, those of us who are teachers, like Deej and myself. You do that with your students, you do that in your community, and you do that very kind of slow and careful work, which doesn't get you any of the media brownie points. Because some of the things that I see happening is a lot of clamor to be invited onto, like, TV shows, radio shows, all the rest of it, and to be the representative. And I just think that old maxim of you can't be in the tent pissing out, you've got to be out of the tent pissing in, right? Which, an expression I was told at university, which I've always loved. I mean, that basically stands true. How can you, on the one hand, lambast an institution for being racist, and then go and accept its terms by, appearing on whatever TV show or engaging whatever conference they're organizing, and speak from the platform as though you're actually taking something down? No, no, you're not. You're only, I think, aggrandizing yourself.
I do want to ask, so people will say, given that if the goal is to mass mobilize people, and given that the ear of the masses are all too often on these places like Sky News and other networks, so you're saying there's no utility in appearing in these places?
I personally don't think that there is. I
Yeah.
don't think that you can win at that game. But that, other people will have a difference of opinion. I think what happens is that somebody good, quote unquote, goes on one of these programs, it generates some clips on social media, everybody applauds, everybody says you were wonderful, and then things move on in exactly the same way. So
Yeah.
what have you done? But if you make a public statement and say, no, I was invited by Sky News or whoever to go on and I've refused for this, that, and that reason, I think you're standing in your power and you're leading by example. That's my personal view. Because I don't
Thank
believe in
you.
representation, but I might be very radical on that. I don't think representation gets people anywhere.
Absolutely. And I would say, like, Alana's worded it far kinder than I would have. I think that, I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I've been thinking about myself, and I've been thinking about all the ways we fall into this trap, right? And I think that a lot of, especially online politics, becomes a game of ego. And I think we need to be honest about the ego satisfaction that
Sure.
people gain from being presented in a mass space and a mass audience, the legitimization they get from that. It's not about the legitimization of your message, because trust me, and I've had conversations with people, if you go on GB News, the person on who's watching GB News is not watching it to be convinced of your argument. They're watching it to laugh at you and to say that your ideas are stupid communist ideas anyway. Setting the terrain that, but you might change one person's mind. There is such better use of your time. There is, because there are young people, there are people who want to be politically educated, who are searching desperately for people to educate them and guide them. And those people aren't on GB News. Those people are already looking for those things. They're already looking for those types of communities. Those people are in the streets, and having conversations with them can be absolutely transformative. And that's what it is for me. And the more I see this happening, I'm like, no, you're legitimizing your own careerism. This isn't about getting political education out there. You're also doing this thing of, and it's an unfortunate thing, whether people are aware or not aware, there's a dynamic that happens when you go onto mass media, you go onto right-wing platforms. You legitimize the ideas of the idiots that you're also dunking on. You legitimize it because you're operating oftentimes in a principled manner. You're oftentimes debating them. But even that kind of discourse, even that dialectic of a debate, presumes that you are on equal footing.
Exactly.
And sometimes you're not on equal footing, right? You're someone with a host of political education, someone who views themselves as principled, and you're talking to a fascist. And in some instances, even saying you don't think the fascist is a bad person, you're just trying to get these ideas. It just doesn't make sense. And at a certain point, I think that we have to stick to our principles. We have to find alternative ways of spreading our message, because mass media is not for us, and it's never going to be for us. Your stuff gets decontextualized. You get, mass attacks, and you also make people in community with you susceptible to those attacks. And I think
that's a very important point.
Yeah.
Because very often the people who can go on these shows, they're protected, right? Because they have a level of notoriety, which means that they're protected. But the people who they're speaking on behalf of, who, by the way, haven't been asked to speak on, for you to speak on their behalf, they're the ones who are open up to attack. And that's very, very dangerous.
Thank you so much for this discussion. It's been super insightful for me anyway. I always love hearing you two speak. So once again, see you soon, people.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.